Welcome to Growth Faculty and our special series with our very own Head of Learning, Barbara Harvey, this session on circular learning, the connected future of learning. Growth Faculty hosts the world's best business minds to present the latest thinking and ideas. And in a moment, Barbara will join me here in the studio to share her circular learning framework to help leaders make the most of every dollar and hour spent on learning and development. I'm your MC, Christine Knimonth, and a very warm hello to our members and enterprise clients. And if this is your first ever event with us, welcome to our learning community. I'm broadcasting live from the inner west of Sydney on the traditional lands of the Gadigal peoples. And we would love to see you too. Post a picture of you or you and your team watching this session on LinkedIn or Instagram and tag us at Growth Faculty for your chance to win a wonderful book prize. We're recording Barbara's session today, so Growth Faculty members can access the replay in the on-demand library. And hello if you're watching or listening to the replay. So let's get underway. As I said, Barbara Harvey is Head of Learning at Growth Faculty, and she brings a wealth of experience with over 10 years in the workforce learning space. Barbara's driving the evolution of Growth Faculty's learning model by building a network of learning experts. And welcome to those of you who are with us today, studying what learners want and developing ways to make learning more engaging and motivating for teams. Barbara, your enthusiasm is infectious. It's great to have you join us today. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Great to be here in the studio today, and welcome to all the learning nerds on the call today. This is the third session, as Chris said, and so exciting to be talking about circular learning. I'm really passionate about thinking about learning more sustainably for us as individuals, but also within organisations. And it struck me as I was driving here today, I was saying to Chris earlier, how different I feel today on the third session versus the first session which we held in March. And the reason why I wanted to share this with you is I deeply believe in the power of reflection, but also in the power of circular learning itself. So what I noticed for myself is in March, it was the first time I'd ever delivered any learning in a studio. I'd been on stage before, virtual workshops, but I hadn't been in the studio with the dressing room lights and James in the production room and the green screens. And I was really nervous, to tell you the truth. And Chris was very encouraging. But over the year, I delivered the session 3 times. I filled in for Chris while she was away. And today I felt really comfortable and energized to be here. And so what I noticed, it was that spaced repetition, turning up, showing up, practicing, reflecting afterwards, that has led me to feel more confident and more comfortable with doing something that 1 year ago I hadn't done before. So my icebreaker for today is for you to think about, if you were to turn back 12 months ago, what is something that you have done in the last 12 months that you didn't know or you hadn't done last year? I want you to think about that. But it might be a recipe you've learned to cook. We've all had to adopt to new AI tools. Maybe it was something you've learned, or a podcast, or something you've practiced, an instrument. I want you to think about, what have you learned or done this year that you didn't know last year that you know now? And so jump in the chat and do that. Chris and I will be monitoring the chat as we go, but really the chat is for you. I want this to be a very vibrant and open discussion. I want you to put in statements. I want you to give examples. If I give examples, I'd love your examples. So I really want this to be a vibrant conversation. This isn't a keynote. This is a community forum of learning for us today. Okay, so about today, we'll come back to your comments in a moment. This is the purpose and agenda. So we're going to be looking at this circular learning model, and really it's more of a mindset in terms of looking at learning more holistically and systemically, and less as a one-off event. But we're going to look at why learning matters. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we investing in learning? We're going to look at wasted learning, so the waste and the sort of landfill of learning that I see about. I'm going to introduce this concept of circular learning. I'm going to look at 5 failures of workplace learning from a learning scientist who I love and adore. And I've got 7 ways to integrate into your workplace. Along the road, here we go. Along the road, I'll be giving you some prompts. So I've got a toolkit prepared for you and some prompts that I want you afterwards to do some homework and reflection and come back to. So you'll have that as you go along the way. Chris, do we have any little comments there?
Yeah,
What
actually
have
they're
we got?
coming in fast and furious. People talking about fitness, gardening, starting a new job, growing confidence in AI tools, and lots of
Amazing.
people contributing, and a couple of people who share my love of pickleball, which is something that
Oh,
I've started
lovely.
learning. So
Which I'd never heard of a couple of years ago. That's awesome. So something I really encourage you to do as well as we get to the end of the year is reflect on what you've learned this year. It's really an important practice. Okay, so here are some references and inspiration for today's session and for some of the work and research that I've been doing. And this is in the toolkit as well. All right, so this is Sir Demis Hassabis. He's the CEO of Google DeepMind and he's a Nobel laureate. And in September 2025 at an innovation summit in Athens, he was asked, given all the disruption and change that's coming and that's ahead, what is the most important skill that the younger generation and us in the workforce need to invest in? Now, his Google DeepMind is responsible for some of the greatest developments in generative AI. So you really want to listen to him when he's asked that question. And his response was learning how to learn will be the most important skill. So the actual ability to learn and how to process things and adapt and develop cumulative knowledge, but also investing in learning because we don't know what's ahead. So we can't be prepared unless we're willing to invest in our own learning. And this is important from an organisational perspective. You said at the beginning, Chris, the dollar value of learning. And this is something I know as learning and development professionals, it's a bit of the holy grail of how do you prove the impact, the return of impact on learning? And I was really excited to find this model. It's really hard to say, so hopefully Chris was testing me early, absorptive capacity. So this is an academic body of research that actually proves the power of an organisation investing in learning. So it is the ability to evaluate and utilise external knowledge as a force for innovation. Because basically if an organisation just sits within itself and doesn't look out to learn, it will stagnate and it will plateau. And I've got an example of this in a moment. So this is a measure of an organisation's ability to learn. And I do love a story. I do love film production, so I thought I'd start here. So this is the story of Kraven the Hunter from Sony. Have you heard of the film? Probably not, because it was one of the greatest film flops of all time, versus the Squid Game from Netflix, which you most likely have heard of. So these are two examples of a fail and a success at absorptive capacity, or basically an organisation's willingness to learn. So in the case of Kraven the Hunter, which is a Sony Marvel film, they relied on past success. So they relied on the power of the franchise, very famous director, Russell Crowe. It was all the formulas for success that they'd had in the past. And of a $100 million budget, it delivered $10 million in revenue. So it was a box office success. Opposite of success, disaster. And this was because they weren't listening to the market. They weren't listening to the trends around the characters and so forth. Fast forward to Netflix. Well, actually, that was it was a few years ago. So with the Squid Game, this was really an unheard of. So I don't know if you haven't seen it. If you have seen it, write in the chat. I actually watched a few episodes and found it so hard to watch because it's quite violent. But it's an incredible show, high production value, and has brought in $1 billion worth of revenue into Netflix. So you can see just the financial return. And the reason why Netflix invested in this production, the director had actually written it 10 years before and couldn't get any funding for it, is that Netflix had been watching and monitoring the consumer behaviour, the appetite for non-English speaking content. They had a sense and had an understanding of the data of what was popular in terms of the generations. Of course, it went on to be a global phenomenon. And what you can see there was Netflix's ability to look outside for information, but the most important thing in absorptive capacity is an organisation's ability to exploit it. So it's not just about funneling in information into a company or learning. It's about taking that learning and exploiting it and using it to make choices. And in their case, an innovative choice that led to commercial success. So based on that, it's a bit of it's maybe just something to think about is how would you describe the absorptive capacity of your team and business? Like if you were to think about how well are you taking on new information and new ideas and adapting and exploiting it for your business? Something to think about. Just leave that there for a moment. Here we go. All right. So that's in terms of a business and organization, but I also believe we need to think more sustainably about our own personal growth as well. And I've been thinking a lot about longevity. So you'll see this a lot. Even we've got Stephen Bartlett next week, Diary of a CEO, and so many of the people that come onto his show talk about longevity. And this is a great book here, The 100-Year Life. And Linda Grattan, I'm a big fan of her, talks about how we've moved from these 3 stages of life, being education, career, and retirement, and we're now moving into this multi-stage life. And if you think about it, education in the old school would finish. You would finish school, and then maybe you do some post-school education, and then that would be it. And Linda Grattan talks about that until that point, education is your occupation. You're a student. You know, as a child, you go to school, you learn. But as an adult, education then becomes a choice. But what we know is that in order to live a long life and have longevity and also to have sustainability in your career, you know, if we need to learn how to learn, then we must be investing in our own education as we go on. We can't, it needs to be less of a choice. So this is Jim Quick. So he was a guest on Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO, and he talks about the power of investing in your own learning and memory. And you'll hear him talk in a moment about digital dementia. So if we're not, we're outsourcing too much of our memory and learning to external sources. So I'm going to play a short video here in a moment, and you can hear from Jim Quick.
You know, my shirt here says use it, right? It's like use it or lose it. It's like our body. If I put my arm in a sling for a year, it wouldn't grow stronger. It wouldn't even stay the same. It would atrophy. And the high reliance on technology, like using your phone as an external memory storage, they call it digital dementia. It's a new term in healthcare. Digital dementia is the high reliance on technology to store information that you would normally have to store in your brain, but now that you don't have to do it, not everybody is exercising those parts of our brain to keep our memory sharp.
Is there science that shows we have to exercise our brain?
You know, the two biggest, two dips cognitively in terms of cognitive performance in people's life cycle usually happens when people graduate school, because somehow they associate education along with learning. They think their traditional education's over, so their learning is, they're done learning, right? And that could be an unconscious belief. But the other dip in cognitive performance is usually when people retire. Often when people retire out of their career, their job, sometimes they mentally retire. And it's interesting that once the mind kind of retires, the body is not too far behind. There was a study done on these nuns. It was a longevity study called Aging with Grace. Great title. They're living 80, 90 and above, and they wanted to find out what was the cause of their longevity. And they said half of it was their emotional faith or gratitude. The other half, they were lifelong learners. And because they were learning all the time, on the daily, it added years to their life, but also life to their years. It made the cover of Time magazine. But I really do believe that, you know, that we have to keep our minds active as much as we have to keep our bodies active.
Okay, I just noticed in the chat, Vivian had asked for the slide, and it's funny because I noticed it went missing. So I'm going to go back here, absorptive capacity, before I go forward. These were the 4 components. So it was about acquiring knowledge, so seeking and recognizing new knowledge, assimilating, making sense of the new knowledge, and then transforming, so integrating and combining the old and new knowledge. Because remember, like particularly adult learning is cumulative. It's based on old knowledge and adding to it. And then exploiting it, so applying knowledge into results. So those are the 4 components. This is in the toolkit. That would have been would have prepared you better for this question. So I must have skipped that slide. So thanks, Vivian. All right. So we've talked about, Jim talked about that, which I think is really interesting. So I think what I want to challenge you today is to really think about your career and your own independent growth. Life expectancy's gone up in Australia, retirement age is going up, people are working into their 70s. We look at the rate of exponential growth and change. So have a think about what does the next 10, 15, 20 years of your career look like. Jim Collins was on Growth Faculty earlier in the year, and he said, don't set yourself a 5-year, 10-year goal, set yourself a 20-year goal. So another challenge for you is by the end of this year, I'd love you to think about a 10-year or a lifelong growth plan. I have some prompts for you in the toolkit. I know we're getting big and philosophical, but I think it's really important to think long term. And that's why, as well as we lead into circular learning as being more of a sustainable approach. Okay, here we go. So if you think about this, learning is really significant. It's really important. It's a key to longevity. Like Jim Quick talked about the nun story, this is what leads to a longer life. This is what leads to financial and corporate success in the case of Squid Game. And yet we have a challenge in our industry. Robbie Bain and I lead the Learning Champions at Growth Faculty. So we bring together a community of learning leaders who are our enterprise clients. We meet once a quarter. And what we hear from them and what we've heard from our Growth Faculty Learning Report this year is that we're kind of in this PR issue where we're having to become marketers to our own people about learning because we're competing for time, we're competing for people's focus, we're competing for learning budget or just budget, and we're competing for relevancy. And what we did in our research is we discovered that people are seeing learning as taking away from their real work, as a distraction from work, which is problematic. And this is also backed up by a Gallup study that was released in Q1 2025, where 41% of employees cite the time demands of their job as the biggest barrier to learning and development. So they're seeing it as two separate pieces. And 37% of managers say time away from daily responsibilities is the main obstacle to supporting employee development. And finally, 89% of chief human officers report that time away from the job is the biggest challenge to employee participation in learning opportunities. So it's quite problematic. The two things are really seen as in competition. And this is what we discovered in our research. I've talked about this in the previous webinars, but for those who are just turning up today, we interviewed close to 100 learning leaders across Australia, Asia Pac, and we asked a series of questions about their learning in their organisation, or there was a group of facilitators and consultants. And here's some of the results here. So learning leaders ranked measurement as a major issue, and this will come up later in the session as well. It's still something we're all trying to crack. Time and prioritisation. We've got this battle of distraction, learning seen as a side dish. And we also have this choice overload. We've never had more learning at our hands. We've got high production value, great quality content, and it's really in, free, not free. And what's happening is it's leading to sort of paralysis of choice where people have got so much at hand. It's leading to overwhelm and to what I call learning landfill. So we're seeing a lot of waste. And we know this because if I just have to ask you, I do this all the time, have you signed up for a webinar, not turned up? Have you joined a course and not finished it? I often talk about self-directed learning being the home exercise bike of learning. Often we're leaving learning on the shelf. Oops. Okay. But what we're also seeing is that as an industry, it's in transition. I think it was 2035, there was some research out recently that we're going towards $800 billion industry, the global workforce industry. I'll have to send that in a follow-up. And so we are transitioning as an industry, and this is within Australia. So we're seeing a shift from traditional to agile learning. So from that less workshop, all-day course workshop to more bite-sized learning on demand. We're seeing a shift in delivery and consumption, and we're seeing an increased investment in modern and agile learning too. So 66% of organisations report that they're likely to increase investment in modern agile learning in the next 12 to 24 months. And only 7% of learning leaders say traditional methods have served learners well. So this is what I believe is leading to, I talk about landfill learning, but also single-use learning. And so it's make, take, waste. So if we think of like the environment, we take an item, we use it, and then we throw it away. And this is what, if we don't think about learning more systemically, this becomes a danger. And even if you just think about one piece of learning, many of us have heard of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It was brought about in 1912 actually, but still holds true. And the idea is that there's such a steep drop-off of memory once you've learnt something new. And that actually has evolutionary need. We can't remember everything because we would walk around and just have too much information in our brain. But if we don't have prompts, and if we don't have a methods to prompt that memory after that piece of learning, you'll just forget it. And that's why it's so important to think about learning as being ongoing, as something that you practice, because it really is, it'll just be a case of single use. And dangerously, as Jim Quick talked about that digital dementia, we're seeing this, and I know the smartphones, you can see it in these stats here, it hasn't helped us in terms of our memory. You know, we think about a phone number, for example. Certainly when I was growing up, you had to learn everyone's phone number. I actually realized the other day, I don't know my daughter's phone numbers. I realized they had new numbers and I didn't know them, which is quite terrifying really. So what we're seeing globally is a decline in memory retention, shorter attention spans, and reduced reading and learning engagement. And so this is showing up in organizations too, because there's a fatigue around learning. So you'll see this was by the Financial Times, some analysis of 18-year-olds who report issues in concentration. Difficulty in concentrating is going up and up and up. And that's correlated with trouble in learning new things. So as our concentration goes down, so does our ability to learn new things. And in terms of the waste of the industry, we're seeing some results here around that too. So 45 to 60% of corporate training is forgotten or unused within a year. 3 to 10% of online courses, these are the big MOOCs, these big, large, self-directed courses, that's the completion rate. And only 12% of employees apply new skills learned in training to their jobs. Now, as a learning professional, and many of you are with me today, it's like, I can't deal with this. I hate this waste. Well, let's stop wasting learning, right? And so that's why I have two things that I've been thinking about. One is, how do we look to the waste industry and the response to the waste industry to combat this waste? But also, how do we think about designing and delivering learning that is more durable, that's built to last? And I ask this question: what makes unforgettable learning? What is it? What is the kind of learning that we experience that we don't forget, that won't drop off? And apart from the prompts and the agitation of memory retention, what about the actual learning experience? So here's a question for you. What is something you have learned, could be in your life, in your career, maybe from your childhood or in the last year, that you have never forgotten? What is something that's really etched in your brain that you've never forgotten? I immediately thought of fairy tales and parables, but I also have a story as well. But I'd love you to write in the chat, what is something you have learned that you've never forgotten? So for me, I've been thinking a lot about driving, because I'm actually teaching my eldest daughter, who's 16, how to drive. And the first lesson, I took her out into the sort of like a rural part of Sydney, and I was sitting there and thinking nostalgically, oh, I can't believe she's 16 and she's grown up and all these things. I was lost in all of that. Sat down, put her in the seat, put the L plates on, turned to her and went, off you go. And she just looked at me and I said, come on, drive. And I'd forgotten that I actually had to teach her how to drive, and she didn't even know how to turn the key. And the reason why I share that is because I actually think, and this will come up in a moment, I think that learning to drive is one of the most interesting approaches and most successful approaches we have to learning the way we conduct driving. But we start from not knowing anything and not even knowing how to turn the key. So I'd love to know any examples there, Chris?
Yeah, actually, what's very interesting is coming out is that people are talking about rote learning things at school, and also song lyrics coming out as well. So, and Julie's Julie says all of us are cleverer than one of us. She's saying there. But yes, song lyrics, times tables,
Yeah.
swimming, riding a bicycle, driving. Fiona says, I had to learn by rote in primary school. And so I think that's true. But I also think when you tell that stories, you
Yeah.
think of the Indigenous peoples and how, stories can be passed down, centuries.
Through generations,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, stories. And the rote learning is interesting because as children, what we're learning something for the first time, and then as adult learners, we build on that. But yeah, I think we're trying to shortcut learning today. We think everything's so quick and fast, but there is some principles of learning that we must keep. And if you think of your times tables, and like I said about being here today, it's practice, repeat, repetition, it's coming back. Like there's no avoiding that if you're to learn something really deeply. And in terms of absorptive capacity, the research has talked about that. It's like the actual organization's ability to absorb and then exploit dependent on the wholeness with which they were learning. You couldn't just skim over the learning. Okay, so that was that. So I thought this would be interesting in terms of what makes forgettable learning. This is Dr. Will Thalheimer. He's one of my heroes. He's a great learning scientist. He's done so much academic research. It's great because I can't read hundreds and hundreds of research papers. He's done the work for you. So here are some 5 failures of workplace learning. If you identify with them or if they're familiar to you, please share in the chat. Some, if not all, you will recognize. So the first one is neglecting to minimize forgetting. That sounds like a mouthful, but basically it's not taking into account the fact that we forget things. So not building into our learning prompts. And that can even be, so he talks about learning in context is really important. So not learning in abstract. So that might even be a case study or reflection questions or joining the docs back to the organization within the learning. It doesn't necessarily mean rote learning in that old sort of memorizing piece, but it's about, making that connection. The second is lack of training follow through. So not coming back to it, that kind of make, take and forget piece. The third is underutilizing prompting mechanisms. So this is something I've been thinking a lot lately, and I've done it for you today. But basically, if you learn how to do CPR, you have a little cheat sheet with a little picture and to remind you. And so it's really important that when we go and learn something, a new framework or a model, to actually have it physically on display when you need it. Because what he talks about is that when you learn, you're using long-term memory, but when you're in the workplace, you're having to work from working memory, and you won't be able to access, sometimes you can't access that long-term memory, so you need a prompt to get you there. So that's something to think about. The fourth is not fully leveraging on-the-job learning, so not actually putting mechanisms in place to practice the learning. So say if you've had a workshop on difficult conversations, like you need to actually be practicing that in the work that you do. And the fifth one is poor measurement practices, which we've talked about many times in our sessions, something I'm still working on myself. But of course, if we're not measuring, we tend to sit with the happy sheets and in terms of learner enjoyment, and we're not thinking about business outcome and whether the learning is showing up in performance. Those are the 2 keys actually for proper learning measurement. If the learning is showing up in performance and if it's having a financial impact or a good business outcome. Okay, so that's the 5 failures. So introducing the circular learning. So this is taken from the circular economy concept. So in a linear economy, we take our resource, we make something new, and then we throw it away, right? And that leads to a lot of waste and, of course, damage and pressure on the planet. And the idea of a circular economy, it's not about necessarily recycling. It's not just recycling. It's about building things to last, that real objection to fast fashion and fast furniture and things like that. So building things to last, then repurposing, reusing, and then always making sure that items don't fall out of the circle. So this is what I was hoping for in terms of the way we think about circular learning, so that we're learning, we're applying, we're reflecting, refining, we're sharing, we're reusing, and that it becomes a more holistic piece. And it's, you know, if we think about one deployment of learning that you might do in your organization, how do you come back to it? Can you practice it again? Maybe 6, 7 months later, can you revisit it? Like, get the value. If you see learning as a resource, like, how are you exploiting that resource over and over again? And so these are the principles, and I'll talk you through a few examples. I just have a few examples of things that you could maybe do. So making learning stick, keeping knowledge in the flow, regenerating learning culture, and shifting from, say, courses into more of an ecosystem of learning. I've also created a little checklist. This is in the resource kit, but you can even have a look at now. You can measure some of your learnings that you're already doing, or sort of practices like and you can follow this up. So are key takeaways remembered after 2 to 3 weeks? Are learnings applied to real work? Do others benefit from new knowledge? Is there structured reflection? So we know this, you don't learn from experience, you learn from reflecting on experience. So this power of reflection, we do not spend enough time reflecting, we don't allocate enough time for it. So if nothing else, if you do nothing else today, is put in a schedule for reflection. Is the content repurposed? Are there mechanisms to adjust based on results? And does your organization reward and recognize applied learning? So these are all questions I'd love you to think about as we go forward. So given that in mind, would you describe your learning culture as linear or circular, or both? Would be really interesting to know. So linear would be like a series of courses, you move on, or are you working towards more of a circular approach where you're revisiting, repurposing? Okay. So just in this last 5 minutes, I'm just going to give you some examples of what circular learning might look like in your organization or as an approach. So it's all still in development, so take one. So the first thing I wanted to revisit was, this is my daughter with her driving. Like I said, I think it's one of the most powerful as a sort of model of learning. You know, they have to do 100 hours, they've got to drive at different times, they've got to keep a record, they've got to reflect. And so having a think about learning that sticks through context, space, and retrieval. So noting that, like building learning over time and coming back to it, number one. Another thing that's really important is reflective discussion. So this is important for memory retention and also for adding context. So don't underestimate the power of this. We did this at Growth Faculty. So, you know, we've got Stephen Bartlett on next week, who I've mentioned. Obviously, I'm a fan, so I can't stop talking about it. And so we developed this. This is a team strategy guide. So you watch the session and then post-session have a discussion. So we actually do this. So I think many of you are members and enterprise members on today. And what we have is, we have a great session delivered by, you know, incredible thought leaders from around the world. And then I design a post-session reflection and discussion. And the idea is that as a peer group, you discuss, you reflect, but you also join the dots back to your own context. And look, you can do that with any piece of learning, but that practice of doing that, and it doesn't necessarily have to have a huge outcome in that moment. You've got to follow up on it. But the practice of doing that will embed that learning further and learning from your peers as well. The other thing is about having prompting mechanisms. So Dr. Wiltham says it's not just good enough to get information into people's heads. What you want to do is trigger their cognition at the right time in the right situation. And I've put this here from Dr. Susan David, who will be visiting us next year, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so this was her pyramid of needs. She produced this in COVID. So she says, we may not be able to go outside, but we can go inside. So it was a little, I remember I had this at the time. It's just a little prompt and a reminder of how to, it was an acceptance, compassion, routine, connection, courage, and reset. So it's really important to have these prompts to keep the knowledge in the flow. So I really encourage you to do that. And of course, peer learning. So we saw this in the Growth Faculty Future of Learning report. We'll send a link to the executive summary of the report after this session. So hopefully you can have a read. And what we saw was this increased appetite for coaching and mentoring. It was selected as the most in-demand learning approach, and peer learning. So 75% of the leaders say that peer learning is equally or more effective than traditional training. So learning is now emerging as not an isolated experience. It's something to be done with and from each other, and it's more powerful when done so. So I encourage you to look at peer learning and social learning in your organisation too. Also, thought I'd throw this in here. This is being announced today. We have an event next year called Leadership, featuring Esther Perel and Susan David. It's really exciting. So we hope you can come along. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is what we're noticing now is this wave of leadership theory and work around relationships. And so the importance and the value of meaningful relationships at work. And what we're seeing is that people are looking for work, for belonging, for community, and for identity. And I think that learning can play an amazing role in providing that belonging and collection and community. So really think about that too. Don't think of learning as being a compliance practice. It really is a sense if done correctly and done creatively, you can create a community of learning in your organisation, and it will have more impact, will have business outcomes, but also will create engagement and connection between your people. So, so coming to the end now, I think, Chris, ready for questions in a moment, but also thinking about learning cultures. So this was the last piece of circular learning. So this is really about learning together. If you've come to the other sessions, you know I'm deeply passionate about the power of social learning. I think this is the silver bullet of learning, this what eliminates the waste, because when we learn together, we're accountable. So if you tend not to turn up to that webinar, if you're by yourself, no one knows. But if we turn up together and show up together and learn together, it creates the most powerful, most effective form of learning. And if it is exciting, and joyful, like we've got with Stephen Bartlett and like leadership, it can create what's called collective effervescence. So that's a concept from sociology that happens when a group of people comes together, shares the same energy or excitement, gets everyone fired up and inspired and connected at the same time. You may have heard me say before, I think that collective learning is like the new office drinks. You know, we're not, the sort of popularity of that has gone down. So let's replace it with enjoying learning together. So just a final few little notes. This is from courses to ecosystems. So thinking about learning in your organisation as being an ecosystem. So some principles here, these are ones that we look to, is building to last, setting a cadence of learning, allowing team discussions, having your prompts and your tools, and creating learning channels, which I know many of you do already. And then finally, I've got these 7 steps, and these are in the toolkit as well. So thinking about embedding, reflecting, and journaling if you can, spaced retrieval, encouraging experimentation. I haven't talked a lot about that today, but really if you have a learning culture, then you're allowing people to take some risks and to experiment as well. Sharing knowledge, integrating prompting tools, measuring what matters, and closing that feedback loop. So making sure you're always improving what you do and coming back to it. I think that's me, Chris. As I go on to questions, I've got a quote here. The most important skill any leader can have is the ability to learn fast, adapt fast, and stay curious. Really interested in your reflections and your ideas. I'd love to know what you're doing in your organisations, what you're doing differently so we can learn from each other. But thank you for being here today, and I'll send that toolkit through to you as we keep evolving this model together. So over to you, Chris, for some questions.
And I was actually just thinking what a wag you are, because there you were, you saw that there was no E on knowledge and you read it. So you thought you would just read it as knowledge.
Knowledge.
That is funny. That made me laugh. Questions haven't been coming into Slido, but I do see that Libby has made a really interesting point, which I think is well worth discussing. And that is, she said, and now I've of course lost it, but she says, basically she's saying, me trying to find it again, basically she's saying that that she struggles to get her learners to do anything post-event.
Yeah.
So that they just won't participate in doing these exercises or the reflection exercises, or, you know, obviously doing anything that's going to bring the practices into their work post-event. So during the event, the joy, the community, the enthusiasm. Post-event, it's gone. It's not there anymore. What would you say about what people could do?
Yes, I think it's about the prompting piece. I know what you're saying. You're not the only one, Libby. It is true. People tend to sort of just think, oh, it's done, tick it off. That's the problem, right? So I think it's one, we have to make the case, and we can all do better at that. So making the case for the follow-up and why it's important is probably essential for someone to understand that, even to know you're actually wasting your time if you don't follow it up. But secondly, I would say it's about having relevant prompts that people can use in time. Everyone's looking for this just-in-time learning. So perhaps it's about like I said, in the case of the conversation course, we had Jefferson Fisher on a while ago. I regret not having little, I might still make them, little prompts, things that he said, and then being able to access them when you need them. I think that's more kind of thinking like that rather than, oh, you have to do this by this time, we're going to follow up by this time, although that's also valuable. And maybe it's about the individual learner making a commitment to themselves to follow up, like to have that prompt and then know that they're going to use it. But yeah, I think it's a valid thing. It's like I said, we're all fighting for everyone's time, and it's a challenge. So yeah, that would be my thing, is thinking about prompts rather than just a follow-up.
Yeah, good point. And there is a question here, and by the way, there is more discussion in the chat about this topic. So Lauren's pitched in saying maybe build it into the session.
Oh, yeah. Good.
And Libby's come back saying time's an issue, but also she is talking about continuous improvement, but very hard to get anyone to even do evaluation. So she's a bit of an uphill battle there. There is a question though, thank you, in Slido. Is time or culture, do you think, the biggest barrier to applying learning and practice?
Yeah, I don't think time is the issue at all. I think I think people say it's time, but I always go, let me check your screen time then. Let me see how long have you been on social. So I think it's definitely a culture piece. It's definitely an allocation of time as well, because what's happened is in traditional learning, you went away and you did a workshop, right? And so you were offline for that day. When I started in professional development, we were at, Barangaroo in the big buildings and people, that was it. You learnt in that time. But now, because of self-directed learning and because we're learning here and there and everywhere, which is great, but then it becomes, well, actually I've got this deadline, or I've got this. And then maybe your leader is not necessarily, they're thinking, wow, that person's off on that course. So we talked about this morning. So role modeling is extremely important. So often you can tell in an organization if the leader themselves is role modeling, investing in their learning or allowing the time or showing. We've talked about this with our clients, is actually, can you get a senior exec to come to the session to what's the word, not role model, but to, can't think of the word, but anyway, to show that this is important. So I think it definitely is a culture piece for sure.
Yeah, well, more discussions to be had, and we'd love to see you back to continue the conversation, because certainly there's a lot of enthusiasm in the chat, very much for people wanting to continue this discussion, and
Great.
really enjoyed it. So thanks so much.
Thanks,
And I do think that back to that time piece, that of course it's leapfrogging. You can spend all this time trying to do something slowly, but to actually go to a quick workshop or webinar or the leadership conference, and you can then leapfrog. You can learn something so quickly by getting it from someone else who's done it before. So,
I like leapfrog.
That might
That's
be
a good one.
Topic of your next learning session. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. Thanks so much, Barbara, as it always is. Wonderful. And it's been wonderful having you also here today. Thanks for all those great questions and for all of your participation in the chat. Well, we do welcome your feedback. There is a book prize draw for those of you who post a picture of yourself, of you and your team, to Instagram or LinkedIn and tagging us at Growth Faculty, and perhaps put your comments about what you thought about it in that post. We also thank you for posting a Google review if you get the opportunity to do so. Thought I'd add that one in. And if you want to continue access to the world's best business minds, there's a full program of live virtual sessions here at Growth Faculty. Of course, Barbara mentioned our next session, the blockbuster author with global headliner Stephen Bartlett, UK entrepreneur and celebrated host of the Diary of a CEO podcast. He's going to be in conversation next Wednesday, October 29, and it will be with master interviewer and guest MC Holly Ransom. So these are the final days to book your spot. Do it now while you're thinking of it so you don't miss out. And all of our live virtual events are included in Growth Faculty membership. If you're a member, thanks for being part of our learning community. If you're a learning champion, we thank you again too for that. On behalf of Barbara and myself and all the team, thanks for being with us today.